It's the best bit, Ian.
Oh, bless you. I would have been earlier, but for bumping into a lady called Lorraine on the highway.
Lorraine?
I think that's her name.
Oh, right.
I think you
Take no responsibility whatsoever.
we hold you vicariously liable.
Ah.
Right. Okay. Good afternoon, boys and girls. So, this week, we might end up with a little bit of trouble, so therefore, as a preface, this is a history talk. It's not a theological talk. It's not my opinions that are coming across. All I can do is give over facts. If those facts don't sit well with you, well, then you can borrow my time machine and go back and have a word with the people involved. So that's point number one. Point number two is I was reminded of something in a brilliant book, which I will recommend later on, actually, called Rebels in the Holy Land, by the author who wrote something very, very clever. He says, I'd like to let you know that not to be fooled by the references and endnotes. He says, I'm not a historian. Historians specialize in one subject, will also know about another subject. They'll be familiar with the whole area of going on. They're trained in research and analysis. I'm not. This is what he says over here, and I'm telling you the same thing. I'm only just able to dip in and out. I can do as much research as possible, but at the end of the day, I'm a student, not a historian. So that's as a preface. It's facts, my understanding of the facts, and they're being told to you as a student, but not as a historian. So last year, we looked at the historical background vis-a-vis the political movements in England, France, Russia, and America before the establishment of the State of Israel, or really before the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the run-up to all of those events with the Dreyfus trial in 1894, and then, of course, the famous Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897 with Theodor Herzl. This week, what I plan to do, or have a little bit of a go at, is the religious perspective. Because as we know, from Orthodox Judaism, Zionism in and of itself, and we will need to divide between the Zionism of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries, 1880 to 1920. Let's just give it those 40 years, because from 1920 onwards, with the First World War, and then, then obviously with the run up to the Second World War and the aftermath of the Shoah, it changed. And then, of course, from 1948 onwards, Zionism became a very different concept, because it was now a reality rather than just a dream and an argument with something to go towards. Zionism, as it was though in the 1880s, and definitely between 1897 with the first Zionist conference to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, forget about the Peel Commission and the White Paper of 1937, that was not accepted by Orthodox Judaism at all, for some very important reasons which we'll have to look at and try to understand. In order to get an understanding of that, though, let's have a look at the religious life in Europe, because that's where it's going along. It's mainly in Russia and the entire Russia, including Belarus, Ukraine. If you know any of the history of that point, they're all the whole pair of the settlement. We'll have a look a little bit at Germany as well, because we've got the famous Shimshon Raphael Hirsch living pretty much that entire century, born in 1808, passing away in 1888, and what it is that they are battling with. So I'm going to, because it was the last one that in my book, so we're working backwards, but we will have a look at Shimshon Raphael Hirsch first. As I said, he was born in 1808 and he passed away in 1888. He was a revolutionary when it came to communal matters, education, and standing up to be listened to. So I'm just putting up two more books from the shelf, because I need to show you what we're talking about. At the age of 22, so in 1830, he was invited to become the chief rabbi of Oldenburg, one of the provinces within Germany. Germany at that time was divided up into a number of different provinces. He became the chief rabbi of Oldenburg. He was actually, with the insistence and the help of a Rav who many of us will know, Rabbi Adler, Rabbi Nosson Adler, who later became the chief rabbi of Britain. He was neighboring on, and he was in the next stage over in Hanover. But Rabbi Hirsch becomes the chief rabbi in Oldenburg, which was a very poor community. He is there for 11 years. Rabbi Dahas was a rabbi of Oldenburg in the 1930s. Okay, that's from Ian to say that a relative of his wife always used it from, and I believe we won't get too far into it, but Margaret did tell us about how the family moved from there in order to get over to South Africa. But we are a little bit before that. We're even before the great revolutions of 1848 from France and then in Germany as well. But during the time that he's there, it's a very poor community, and he doesn't have a lot to do communal-wise, and he's able to work on himself, his own learning. As we'll see from another one of the great Rabbanim of the time, they put time and effort into it. They weren't all prodigies. A number of them were hard workers. As we'll see later on, another one, Chaim Tziv Berlin, who was from Volozhin, same thing, wasn't a prodigy, just sat and he learned. But during this time, Rav Hirsch wrote a number of books. The first one that he wrote was something called 19 Letters, published in 1836 by a non-Jewish publisher, because a Jewish publisher thought, waste of time, waste of money, nobody's going to buy it. And it was his first foray into the written word to try to see, will I be able to express my ideas? Will it be taken up? And it goes through, it's a series of fictional letters being written by a irreligious, reform-leaning teenager to a religious friend who responds there and back. And it's how he sets out his ideas of what is responsibility. Bear in mind at this point, as we've learned previously, reform, enlightenment is really upping its game. And they have, tremendous success in Germany and Vienna, and Austria from this point up until the Second World War. Vienna, in the years prior to the Second World War, the rate of intermarriage was terrible. Another place that was actually Warsaw. Fun enough, we hear about Warsaw, so Jewish, we'll get to that later on. But he writes in 19 letters. It was so successful that within a year, he writes another book called Chorev. This was immediately picked up by a Jewish publisher. Says, hey, the first one worked, I'll pick up the second one. Chorev is his thesis on the mitzvahs incumbent on a contemporary Jew. And it was where he put out saying that even though, yes, modernity is creeping in, we look back, we think 1830s, how modern can they be? From the perspective of an 1830s person, it was modernity. I know I was totally as an aside. The other day there was the history on BBC. Somebody put up a clip from 1971 of the car of the future. What they thought was £55,000, and the different bits and pieces that it had there of what it was going to be. But modernity, all for its time, its perspective, what they thought. So he was looking at it, what is modernity and what does that mean for the Jew? And Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, he writes his book. The next year he starts his outright fight, and I call it a fight against reform, with his first book, Naftuli Niftalti. His name was, trying to have this fight against reform in 1838. But he moves along. In 1841, he becomes the chief rabbi of Emden. They needed to have an enlightened rabbi. Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch worked because for a year he had been in the University of Bonn. He studied there for less than a year. He does not get his doctorate, although he's called sometimes Dr. Hirsch erroneously. But he went there for one purpose. He says, I need to know what are the arguments going to be put against me. And so because of that, he was good enough to be accepted as a chief rabbi of Emden. He was only there for about 6 years and then moved along to Nikolsburg. Sorry, it was in Nikolsburg. He was in Emden, then he went along to Nikolsburg in 1847 because there they needed to have the enlightened rabbi. And he fit the bill. The next year, of course, in 1848 was when we have all of the revolutions that sweep across Western Europe. And Rav Hirsch said there's something which is very important. We will play into Zionism later on. He says, when he's looking about the quest for equality, and think about, take what's being said then and place it now in 2021 when we think of equality of gender or of non-gender and anything else out there. Let's leave race alone and religion. Let's look along that for a moment. He says the quest for equality is not the goal per se, but rather a means for improving a compromise-free Torah life. So yes, what's happening at the moment then, 1848, is good. There is enlightenment. But enlightenment in and of itself, you've lost the point of it. It needs to have a goal, which is the ability of a Jew to lead a compromise-free Jew life. If we think of what happens not long later on with the May laws, the anti-Semitic May laws in 1882, not long after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in March 1881, when his son takes over and he's going to give enlightenment to the masses in Russia. What does that then mean? Well, Jews are no longer allowed to trade on Sundays. They're not allowed to have the quota within the universities and the schools. You had areas which high percentage of Jewish students, they had half-empty schools because so enlightenment in and of itself is not necessarily a good thing. Rav Hirsch pointed this out already in 1848, that there's got to be a reason, a mator, a purpose, which is the Jewish way of life, a compromise-free way of Jewish life. Bear that in mind for when we look at what's happening later on in 1880s and 1890s with the rise of Zionism and a land for the Jewish people. Just to finish off his life, he then, of course, moves to Frankfurt, where he's for 37 years, from 1851 to 1888. And that is really where he makes a real name for himself. But I wanted to put them there to have a little bit of context of a Rav who understood modernity and who saw the pitfalls, but fought very strongly for it. Two other rabbis before we go on to religion with regards to Zionism. Two of them you would have heard of. First one is Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, or his real name is Rabbi Yisrael Lipkin, but he gets the name Salant because he moves along to Salant. And he sets up the famous Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, famous movement. Ian's about to unmute himself and tell us. He is or he isn't.
Is this Bet Yaakov L'chuven Elcha?
Oi, heaven forfend. No, don't worry. We're later on, we're going to take a pot shot at Bilu. No, he starts the Muslim movement. Nothing to do with Beis Yaakov L'chuven Elcha. Beis Yaakov L'chuven Elcha couldn't have been more detached from Rabbi Yisrael Salanta. This is Orthodox Jewish, the Muslim movement.
Just shows you how enlightened I am.
Born in 1810, passes away in 1883 in Latvia to begin with, but he's taught by Rabbi Zvi Brody in Salant in Lithuania. And so that's why he gets the name Yisrael Salanta, because he moves along there. He's engaged, and we're having these stories seem to repeat themselves over and over. We've had it a number of times before. One of the most notably was the Maharan of Prague. So we're going back 200-300 years. Rabbi Yisrael Salant was engaged at the age of 18 to the daughter of the wealthiest Jew in Salant. During the engagement, the Shver loses all of the money, comes to his son-in-law, of course, you're free to walk away, and himself says, Chas v'shalom, I'm not walking away there, insist on going ahead with the Shidduch. He stays in Salant for 18 years and he starts the Muslim movement. He hardly punishes everything. As he says, not everything one thinks needs to be written. I write it down in specific. Not everything one thinks is worth expressing. not everything that one expresses is worth writing, and not everything that is written is worth publishing. I came across a line once, inside every person is at least one book. And that's where the majority of them should stay, inside every person. But just because you think it, you don't need to express it. Just because you express it, you don't need to write it. And just because it's written, you don't need to publish it. And I would say one further, just because it's been published doesn't mean you have to read it. As he said, writing is easy, but erasing afterwards is very difficult. Yes, Alan.
Just Jonathan will know that Rabbi Salanter, or Lipkin, as he's known, had relations in Liverpool, descendants in Liverpool, one of whom was married to my late Uncle Louis. Do you remember, Jonathan, the Lipkin family?
Yes, I do.
They were the descendants of Rabbi Salanter.
Rabbi Salanter.
Wendy Lipkin, Wendy.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, right. Let's go back to the original one. Sorry, we're going to go back to Lithuania now. But he became more of a student of humanity than of theology. At one point, he met Rebbe Zundel of Salant before he'd written this. And he says to him, what should I do? Rebbe Zundel told him, study ethics and become God-fearing. And that sent him on his way. And he says, there's a famous story. He once went running into yeshiva, and he says, and they said, what's the matter? He said, I've just learned a phenomenal lesson in life from the shoemaker, poor shoemaker. I walked past him, it's late at night, and I see him, he's working on his bench, bent over with a little candle. And I said to him, what are you doing this late at night? He says, so long as the candle burns, one must mend. Says Rabbi Yisrael, that's my life lesson. Ran out the yeshiva, and the Bachram sat there. As long as the candle, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the candle of God is the soul of man. As long as that candle is burning, you've got to continue studying them. And so that really becomes the start of his movement. And somebody, a person came to him and said, I've only got 1 hour a day. Should I learn Torah or study ethics? What do you think he told him to do?
Both.
Yes, but in a different way. He said, study ethics. If you learn ethics for 1 hour a day, you'll find out that you've got more than an hour free. You'll figure out you've also got time to learn Torah as well. The difference between the important and the urgent is if you do the important when they come up, most things don't become urgent. But obviously, at the moment, when I say at the moment, where we are now, 2020, 2021, got to make reference of his stance in 1848, 1849, with the epidemic that took place in that area. Now, there are a number of reports about what Rabbi Stroll did at that time. Bearing in mind, in 1848, he was born in 1810, he is only 38 years old. He may have had a name for himself, but he wasn't the chief rabbi. He was, a studious, well-spoken, but still, on the pecking order, a 38-year-old Rav. When it comes to an epidemic in Yom Kippur, what does he do? According to some reports, he stood up on Yom Kippur, told everybody, we've got an obligation, you've got to look after your life, made Kiddush, ate, drank, took a piece of cake and ate, and told everybody that they were not allowed to fast. Other versions of it say he encouraged anybody who wasn't feeling well to eat. With others, he worked together with Rabbonim to put out an edict. There are various discussions about it. What an outflow of that story is that, according to one view, he then got called to task. And instead of telling them why he said what he said about fasting on Yom Kippur, he started giving them a share about something else entirely different. He said, I'm not going to argue the point. You've got your view, I've got my view. Instead, he showed them his learning about what it was that he was able to do. But he also set up an entire hospital. Let's make sure I get this correct. Where we've got it over here, not on this one. The hospital that he set up at this time. And of course, he gets in trouble for doing it. So he set up a hospital at this point, and he got all of the young students to go along to it. But an older man saying, it's disgraceful. How on earth are you able to do it? He started shouting at him. What did he do? Rabbi Stroll, who was known as Rabbi Stroll, he started shouting. He says, you idiot. You're going to tell me what's permitted, what's forbidden? I've taken upon myself to ask 60 to 70 young students, Talmidei Bachur Yeshiva, to work with ill people constantly. I've promised their parents I'll keep them healthy. And Be'ezus Hashem, they will be. They are healthy. No one has taken ill. Are you prepared to do this? When the guy, he said, no, I'm not. He says, leave me alone. But this is the environment that they're living in the mid-19th century, when Torah learning, ethics, halacha, very important. Speaking about halacha, the other Rav is Rav Shlomo Gans Frieda. I think pretty much all of you either have or have held in your hands the book that he wrote. Rav Shlomo Gans Frieda wrote a book, which I'm sure you've held and picked up in your hands. That is the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, the abridged Shulchan Aruch. Born in 1804, passing away in 1886 from Uzhgorod in Hungary. He was orphaned at a young age. And at the age of 31, in 1835, was when he published a sefer called Keset HaSefer, the author's inkwell. And the Chassam Sofer, who was one of the big fighters against reform, said, after he wrote his approbation to that book, said, any of my students who want me to write an approbation on their forthcoming books have to prove to me first that they have read this sefer, the author's inkwell from Rabbi Gansfried. If they have not read his book, then their sefer doesn't deserve my approbation. Then in 1864, when he was 60 years old, he wrote the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, and from there developed a whole series of societies in shuls done by chief rabbis, Rosh Yeshivas, the society of Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, that they would sit and they would learn. And that's the environment that people are living in when we start to creep towards this concept of modern Zionism. We will slot in a little bit out with the Netziv, Rabbi Berlin, but we'll get to him shortly. Let's have a look at what's happening at this point from the Jewish political point of view. And I'm not talking about the countries. We did, the last year we looked at the British, the French, the Russian, the Americans. We're looking at from the Jews themselves, what is pushing them. So we will have Bilu, but Bilu is not until 1882. And we're going to show the problems we're going to have with Bilu. But before that, you've got the Bund. The Bund is set up in the 1870s by Aaron Shmuel Lieberman. The Bund literally means a union, but its full title was the Allgemeine Jüdische Arbeiterbund in Litauen, Poland, and Russland, which is the regular, the democratic, the Allgemeine, the regular Jewish Workers' Bund Union in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. That was set up in order to give rights to Jewish workers. Now, if we have a look at what's happening in Russia at that time, bearing in mind the Tsar is about to be assassinated in 1881, people are looking, the serfs are looking to have freedom of expression, the ability to work for themselves, to earn their own money, to have their own land, which is why, when we say about having their own land, which is why one of the May laws in 1882, the anti-Semitic May laws, forbade a Jew to get a mortgage. So what? You can't own the land. If you can't own the land, you can be kicked off as soon as they decide they're going to kick you off. You've got no permanence. So the whole of Russian society, and when we say Russia, we talk about that entire area, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, the whole area, including what is today White Russia and Ukraine, they're all looking to have their own ability to dictate their own life. And this will play a lot into the political Zionism. And we really, I must stress again, we're going to be looking at political Zionism, and we're going to leave it on, although it does play into religious Zionism, national Zionism as well. Well, it will play into that. But you've got in the 1870s the Bunda. We want to have the union of the workers for the Allgemeine. The Allgemeine, you may have heard of the Allgemeine Journal, a newspaper. This was for the everyday workers of Jews, the union in Poland, Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. And they are pushing for that. Then in 1881, we have the pogroms. The pogroms of 1881 to 1884 caused terrible disasters in Russia. Now, some of them only take place for a few days, and if we think about the devastation that had happened earlier with the massacres of Shemlinki massacres, a couple of 100 years before, and it was nothing in comparison to that. Maybe in total a couple of 100 Jews killed when we think about thousands. If we think about what happened in the Crusades, when we think what's going to happen round the corner with the Holocaust, life-wise, in loss of life, the pogroms in 1880s were not vis-a-vis the others weren't that bad. The loss of one Jewish life is terrible. The loss of any life is terrible. The murder of a person because of his religious beliefs, never tolerated. But these weren't the mass loss of life as later on. It was more about loss of civility and no knowledge of do we have stability. Think of Shalom Aleichem, or you probably know him a little bit better. What was Shalom? I gave the game away. I was meant to ask you, who is Shalom Nachamovich Rabinovich? Shalom Aleichem, born in 1859.
Ashley Ginsburg.
Pardon?
Ashley Ginsburg.
No, Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Nachamovich Rabinovich. Don't know where the name Ginsburg comes from.
I thought it was Ashley Ginsburg.
No. Now I'm thinking of the guy who has the pen name Shalom Aleichem, who writes Fiddler on the Roof. Now, the pogroms, remember when the policeman comes along and he says, look, I'm sorry, Tevye, this is what we've got to do. And what was it? Let's smash a few windows, disturb the wedding, rip up. It wasn't about murder. Yes, there were those that jumped on the bandwagon. Yes, the authorities stood by. At other times, the authorities jumped up. In Lithuania, at one point, they went mad. They said, you're destroying the infrastructure. The Americans told them off. It was mainly about let the Jews know they don't belong here. We don't necessarily have to kill them. There was anti-Semitism, of course, but it was not here. This is not where we want you, not where we need you to be. So it wasn't about the wholesale murder of the Jews. It was about reminding them that you don't really belong here. Move on. Nothing for you to have over here. If we look at this for a moment from a religious perspective, what is, the three daughters, well, the first three daughters that we read about in Fiddler on the Roof, their marriages, what breaks down? The first one makes her own shidduch. It's not too bad to make your own shidduch. But still, Tevye, at least Motel is a frum boy. The next one, what happens? All of a sudden, that's reform. The third one is not Jewish, going along, Zion. And that was the progression that Shalom Aleichem was looking at. Look back, that was the progression that the rabbis saw as well. So we've got the Russian pogroms in 1881 to 1884, which caused the anti-Semitic May laws in 1882. Now, Ian has mentioned Bilu. He mentioned it last week. He mentioned it 2 weeks ago, and he mentioned it just now, Bilu. Beis Yaakov Lechuvan Elchas, where it comes from. Well, in fact, we can even, if I come up over here, I should be able to, Safarium, show you the posuk where Beis Yaakov comes from. We need to go to explore the library. Let's open up to Isaiah chapter 2, verse 5. So I'm just going to share the screen with you. This is where Bilu gets the name from. Over here. Beis Yaakov Lechuvan Elcha. Let's make it a bit bigger. There you go. Bilu. Beis Yud Lamed Vav. Beis Yaakov Lechuvan Elcha. House of Jacob, let us walk. You can all read. What does it say next? Ba'oir Hashem, by the light of the Lord. Bilu, this Zionist movement that began up there that says, let us go up to Israel, specifically and very methodically and very carefully thought out, said, Ba'oir Hashem is not what we want. Beis Yaakov Lechuvan Elcha, house of Jacob, let us go. We're going to go up. And in fact, their original name was not Bilu. They had another posuk. Let's give you the other posuk that they used to do over here. So over here, let's take it, not Isaiah 1. We're going to go instead to Shemos. It's not that long ago since you had it. Exodus, chapter 14. Verse 15. Their first thing was, they originally had Daber. The first name was Daber al Bnei Yisrael v'Yisrael. Dab U. That was their first name. Dalet Aleph Beis Yud Vav. Dab U or Davu. Bilu was originally known as Dabu. Daber al Bnei Yisrael v'Yisrael. Speak to the children of Israel, and they should journey. They took that out. They dropped that name because the first one is Vayom Hashem Moshe. God said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me?" You know, they dropped that name because it was a command by the Almighty. Go along, you should journey. They said, we're not being told by God to journey. We've decided. Mig Gain, we're the ones that are going to make our way to Israel. So Bilu, which originally had been Daber B'nai Israel, speak to the children of Israel, they would go, drop that pasuk, picked instead from Isaiah, Beis Yaakov L'chu V'necha, but we're very careful not to have the next two words, Ba'ir Hashem, in the light of God. So that gives you an inkling. This is 1882. Gives you an inkling why in 1897, when you've got the first Zionist conference, what you don't have orthodoxy jumping up for joy saying, hey, Baruch Hashem, we're all going to go to Eretz Yisrael. That wasn't the plan. And in fact, Israel, or then Palestine, was not even necessarily the destination. Anywhere where Jews can have autonomy, that is what they wanted. And when Herzl wrote the book Alt Neuland, when was it published? Alt Neuland. Ian, you keep yourself unmuted. Just keep it unmuted.
1898?
1902, but don't worry, you were close enough, within 4 years. 1902 is when you write that. And there's a famous line in that. Originally in German, his famous line in that book was?
In 5 years or 50 years?
Sorry?
5 years or 50 years?
No, okay. Im tirtzu zelo chalom. If you will it, it is no dream. Now, a little bit of research that I've come up with seems to say that this was already coined in 1882 by Zev Dubno, who was one of the founders of Bilu, of the original Davu and then Bilu. Will it won't be a dream. This is what we're dreaming for. But what was it that they were dreaming? They were dreaming of a place where they could have political autonomy. Being in the land of Israel, nishti nishtaher, you know what? Fine. Whether it will be or it won't be. It can be in Uganda, it can be in South America, it can be anywhere. Now, having political autonomy had happened before. We had the Vad al-Barotzes, the Council of the Four Lands. We had areas where Jews literally stood up and made themselves known. Famous of them, Rabbi Kiva Eger, who fought against reform, this we learned the previous week, 1761 to 1838. He was a very reluctant pulpit rabbi, becomes the chief rabbi of Posen. And just, to give an idea of his humility, when he arrived, he already had his new son-in-law, who became Ramosha Sefer, the Chassam Sefer, who really, a lot of the things that we do nowadays of Orthodoxy were halachas written by the Chassam Sefer, who wrote them in order to define what Orthodoxy was and not reform, such as Second Day Yom Tov, where to put the bimmer in the shul, etc. There were a number of halachas there, but he arrives in Posen and the whole community comes out to greet him. And when Rabbi Eger looks over, he thinks, they must be coming from my son-in-law, famous Rav. He got off the carriage in order to, to be one of the accompaniments. The Ramosha Sefer automatically assumed they're here for his father-in-law, who is the chief rabbi. He got off his carriage. They looked in the carriage and see that both sides, the carriage was empty. But why do I mention him? Because in 1831, when there was a cholera outbreak, he personally, Rabbi Eger personally cared for the sick, and King Frederick III of Prussia gives him a medal for it. Jews took responsibility, set up their own rules. Yes, but they did so under the knowledge that this was part of Galut. We were under exile. And what wasn't being changed was a Torah way of life. I'm giving you the names of a couple of rabbis during that time and what it was they were pushing towards, what it was important for them. A couple of weeks ago when we were doing 1843, So 3 weeks, lectures ago, when we came up to the development of Hasidism and how they worked with Tsarist Russia and the conference of 1843, when the Russians wanted to interfere with Jewish education, and the Hasidim said no, they weren't going to do it, and they kept it free. They kept Russian involvement out of it, but it didn't always work. Just going to quote one other of, I mentioned him at the beginning, Reb Naftali Yehuda Berlin becomes the Netziv of Volozhin. The Netziv means the pillar. Even though his surname is Berlin, he wasn't in Germany, he was in Volozhin. Born in 1817, passes away in 1893. He was no infant prodigy. He was a hard-working young man. In fact, he got married at the age of 14. Fascinating. He got married at the age of 14. His father-in-law was Reb Itzler, was a Rosh Hashiva, and it was it must be 1817 plus 14 years old is 1831. He comes home from Yom Kippur. He's about to make Kiddush, and he looks around. He sees that his son-in-law is not at the table. He asks his daughter where it is. She's in his room. He goes up to the room. He's sitting learning. His father-in-law, who was Rosh Hashiva, goes mad at his son and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "You've just finished fasting for 25 hours. You're straight away learning. You need to come and eat." The kid was 14. He says, "It's time to learn." He brought in that. Later on, he testified. He says, it wasn't, he didn't have the inborn skills to do it. But the yeshiva in Volozhin was founded, we looked at the other week, in 1802. And this was about having students sitting and learning. And before political Zionism came along, before the Bund comes down, before any of them, you have this yeshiva system pushing its way forward, having thousands upon thousands of students. The Netziv during his lifetime had over 20,000 students that went through his yeshiva. Yes, he was there for 40 years, but over 20,000, there was on average 500 students a year sitting and learning with him. Think of how that spread out from his life. At the age of 32, the father-in-law passed away. It goes to his brother-in-law. A couple of years later, the brother-in-law also passes away, and Reb Naftali Tzvi Berlin is set up as the Rosh Hashiva of Volozhin. He is there. He runs yeshiva from 1853 until 1892. In 1892, the Russians get involved. Bearing in mind, we've had the anti-Semitic May laws in 1882. By 10 years later, and this is before Dreyfus in 1894, Bilo has been set up, and we'll get to other religious Zionist ones, have already been there for about 10 years. But the Russians go in and they shut the yeshiva down in 1892. We mentioned just now about the conference in 1843. When we stood up to them, by 1892, the Russians came, they shut the yeshiva down. The Netziv was banished from Volozhin. They wouldn't even let him stay. And he ends up in Warsaw. He tries to make Aliyah. He was on the executive council of Chovevei Tzion. And we must mention here the religious Zionists. Chovevei Tzion, very much ones that wanted to go to Israel and live there an Orthodox Jewish life. He really looked at saying, what is the point of making Aliyah? Why is it I'm going along? It's in order to be able to live a life in Eretz HaKodesh under the laws of Torah's Kodesh. It wasn't for him about a political entity. It was for him about being back in the Holy Land. Now, I've got to say there were others, and we'll get to them, we will still do, who disagree with that either, who said we cannot force God's hand. You can't say, right, Mashiach will come now. But he, the last year of his life, he lives in Warsaw. He does not make Aliyah. Fortunately, he's not well. He lives in Warsaw for the last year of his life, and he's convinced by his Talmidim to put his thoughts, all of his writings down, to actually write them down. And he wrote something fascinating. He says, lots of people become famous because of their writings. He said, it's better to become famous because of a mistake in your writing. How? How does he prove it? He says, an example, an error in the book can enhance the reputation of a writer more than the wisdom and the honor. Why? Because if you become known because of a little folly, the very discovery of that error is proof of the work that the book is being read. So he says, when they find it, we now say, we put it in because every publication has got to have a mistake. The Shul magazine, that was for you. He says, they find a mistake, at least they're reading it, and at least it is bothering them. He wanted to make Aliyah, he doesn't. His son His son does make Aliyah, but he has a different family name, Rabbi Meir Bar Ilan. Bar Ilan University comes along there, Bar Ilan, the Bar Ilan CD. He does make Aliyah. Unfortunately, he passes away in Jerusalem, Pesach, 1949. So he gets to see Israel for 11 months as a modern state. And his fight, our aim is to fight against alien religious practices and non-Jewish culture. And from where better to fight that battle than from Jerusalem, the holy city, from where wisdom and knowledge spreads throughout the world. Any partition of this town, which has been held sacred by Jews from generation to generation, may God forbid lead to the decline of its sanctity. And that's the view of Orthodox Jews that were going on. That was already in 1949. Israel was already a reality. But what sort of reality was it? Let's go to what was happening in 1880, 1890, and 1900. We have, as I've mentioned a number of times, you've got the pogroms in 1881 to 1884. You've got the anti-Semitic May laws in 82. You've then got the Dreyfus affair. So it's not only in Russia, it's also in enlightened France, liberty, democracy, and everything for everyone. What were the three words of the French Revolution? Liberty, equality, and fraternity, which of course were based on Jefferson's liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. The rule of three was a very important one there. Even in the enlightened France, yeah, in Russia, yeah, well, and even there you have the Dreyfus affair in 1894, and then we've got the terrible pogroms in Kishinev in 1903, which were a prelude to the Russian Revolution in 1905. So when Theodor Herzl calls together the first Zionist conference in 1897 in Basel, and they are going to say, well, what is it we're looking for? They were looking for something that was not Torah orientated at all. For them, the whole point of it was to have a democratic place. It wasn't about being able to have a place where Jews could live freely as Jews. It was a state run by Jews, but it wasn't a Jewish state. And this was the view even later on, after you have the Peel Commission done later on in 1837. They said the Knesset Gedolah, the Great Jewish Assembly, cannot lend its consent to the Jewish state as proposed by the Peel Commission. The identity of the state at that point, of what they were looking for, of what Herzl was arguing about, was to have Jewish natural and historic right to the land. You know, they were putting Tzur Yisrael, the very fact that in the Hatikvah there's no mention of God's names. When they speak about Tzur Yisrael, the rock of Israel, was specifically depict the name of God, which is not religious, the rock of Israel. There was a concerted effort to have nothing religious or Jewish within it. It was going to be a democratic state. Democratic state is very good, but the democratic state was not about Judaism. It wasn't about religion. Even in 1985, when the Israeli Knesset was adopting an amendment to the Chukei Yesod, the basic laws, they were going to establish a state as primarily being a democratic state. Ben Gurion is rumored, whether he said it or not, I don't know. He will be happy when the Israeli prisons are filled with Israelis, murderers and rapists. Whether he said it or not, I don't know, but these sentiments, this is the sort of thing that he would have been looking towards. But that wasn't what orthodoxy, it wasn't what Judaism was looking at. Bearing in mind that they'd been battling against reform. It wasn't that much earlier when they'd been battling against Shabtai Tzvi. But the view of orthodoxy was at least a Jew who's become irreligious can find his way back because he knows what he's dropped. But if you say that being Jewish is by having a Jewish state, you know, and in fact, one of the lines that they came up with, that a Jew follows halacha, is as Jewish, and one of the early thinkers is as Jewish as I am, is as Chinese as I if I eat Chinese food. That doesn't make me Chinese. You've got to be born and live in China to be a Chinaman. So being born and living in Volozhin, was it? This was Max Mandelstam, who was a leading figure in the Zionist movement. One who is not a Zionist, at least at heart, is not a Jew. To be a Zionist is to be a Jew. There are many who observe the commandments, such as bris milah, tzitzis, and tefillin, very careful with shechita, daven at the proper times. In a national sense, they are as Jewish like I am Chinese if I would abide by Chinese law. Halacha doesn't make you Jewish. Living in your Jewish land makes you Jewish. Put that into the minds of the Orthodox rabbis in the 1880s. And I wonder why they turn around and says, nothing to do with us. We will have nothing to do with this. You're basically telling us that if we pick up our bags, if we leave behind our tefillin, but we live in the biblical land, we'll be all right. But it didn't even need to be a biblical land. From their perspective, Zionism uprooted Judaism in a stronger way than Reform or assimilation. At least Reform kept its roots. It wanted to keep halacha. Let's adapt halacha, but it's still halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Zionism in 1880 up until 1920 and even beyond that was nothing to do with Judaism. It was to do with the democratic rights of this nation. They wanted to rewrite the Shulchan Aruch. Nachman Bialik, another one of the leading lights of Zionism at that time, says, we've got a new national rebirth, not a Jew, a national rebirth. Let's rewrite one, get rid of Eira Chaim and Yeridea, the books of Shulchan Aruch, which is so important of us. But no, we don't need that anymore. We need to go to a place because it was in this place that we became a nation. When they finally decided on Israel, they said, here was where we became a nation. No, we became a nation at Mount Sinai. And this was the place where we wrote the book of books. For them, the Torah wasn't halacha. It was in the worldwide literary of books. I've got behind me, David's got it as his fake, his virtual background, books. You know, nowadays they don't speak about a selfie, they speak about a shelfie. What's on your shelf? What's behind you on the shelf? To them, the Torah was the book of books. You've got books, this is the chief book. It wasn't a religious thing. It wasn't a dogma of a way of life. It was as divorced from Judaism as you could get, which is why going to Uganda made perfect sense. If we can be a democratic state there, then it's just as good as being a democratic state in the land of Israel. And in fact, if we have a look at what the white paper after the Peel Commission, when they backtracked on the Balfour Declaration, we didn't mean it, we don't want to kick the Palestinians out, it's not so. And of course, but what did the Jews do? What did the Yeshuvniks do from 1937 and then when the war broke out in 39-40? What was the rallying call of the Jews in the Yeshuv? We will fight the war as if there's no white paper, and we will fight the white paper as if there's no war. But for them, in that time, it was very much Orthodox Judaism. Chief amongst them very much was, yes, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, who was the Rebbe at that time, his son-in-law, his son, the Friedrich Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, took over from him when he passed away in 1920, who carried on until 1950 when he passed away when the seventh Rebbe took over. Very much staunch opposition to the democratic Zionism at that time. And the Rebbe was also said, religious Zionism is going to get caught up with it. And so much so, they said, moving to Israel, you might then think this gives our backdoor hechsher to it. Now, before we finish, and I'm maybe maybe I shouldn't do it, but I will open it to a few questions this time. I just want to recommend that there's one area of Zionism that we forget, because before them, we have, and this is a brilliant one, book called Rebels in the Holy Land. It's a brilliant book. This was a guy I said at the beginning, says he's not a historian. He's looking at the group of Jews that went around that set up the sixth Yeshuv in Israel. In 1882, there were 10 men in the hamlet of Pavlovka in White Russia. Baron Rothschild in faraway Paris said, I will support your establishment of a farming colony in Palestine. They went along with a teacher as well, and they set up a colony in there, which was called, eventually, it then gets named Maskeret Batya, when Rothschild named it after his mother, Batya Rothschild. But they were very much a religious group of Jews that went there, and the book is all about their fight in 1880 1888/1889 was a Schmitter year, and they wanted to keep Schmitter. The backers or the officers working from Rothschild didn't want to let them do it, and there was a massive argument. Things were being Rothschild by that time, it's gone too large, you know, and it was being done by his apparatchiks working out of Paris. He was a from Jew, wanted them to do it, but if you go along to North Israel and you can go along to Maskeret Batya, you see the places that they set up there. Maskeret Batya now has got 11,000 residents. It doesn't have a single
Police officer.
traffic light. It doesn't have a single traffic light there, but it was set very much as a religious one. Now, the historians who look at Aliyah Bet, which we'll get to next time, ignore the first Aliyah because a lot of it contained within it religious Zionists, but they weren't Zionists. So when we start to look at religious Zionism, at that point they weren't Zionists. They were Orthodox Jews that wanted to live their life in Eretz HaKodesh. It wasn't Zionism. Zionism in 1880 to 1920, it changed a bit after 1917. It definitely changed after 1948. You know, between 1917, 37, with the Bill paper of 48, it had changes along the way. But at that point, with Theodor Herzl on the first Zionist conference, it wasn't Jewish, it was democratic. There were Jews, you know, the Netziv, part of Chayvei Tzion. You know, we've been davening about the return to Zion for 2,000 years. Long before it became a political entity. The problem with it at that point, and why it split Judaism in two, and why you now have the Neturei Karta who go so far as to then, you know, will go along and daven, you know, go along to Ahmadinejad, daven for Arafat, and so that. That's still a hark back to them. In Lubavitch, it changed in 1948 because you now had a reality on the ground. There's Jews living in a Jewish land, and there's Jewish lives at stake, in which case they must be supported. But every one of, I'm going to pick Lubavitch, A, because I know it best, but B, also because the Rebbe was the one who says, I'm not changing my stance on political Zionism. I'm worried about Jews, Jewish lives, and Jewish religious lives. And so therefore, in 1948, Kfar Chabad was set up. And what was Kfar Chabad? Kfar Chabad was a Jewish religious farming village. It was a kfar, it was a farming. And that's what it was built upon. And they said, let us work on it now with the Jews that are living there. So Lubavitch sort of didn't change its stance on political Zionism, but said, what's the reality on the ground? Are there Jews living in this area? Yes. It would make no difference where they are, but they're living here. The fact that it also happens to be in Israel gives us an added obligation. But we can't go back, and the Neturei Karta still live in that sense of Zionism is treif. And the problems today, there are those that are putting out notices saying that they refuse to allow the vaccine because the vaccine is being done by the Zionism, and they're just trying to kill us all. I mean, but that goes back to the arguments in, you know, 140 years old, without looking at changing the time and saying, what is reality, what we can do with it. So I think I've sort of given you the religious background to Zionism as it was a political entity at the end of the 19th century, why from a religious perspective that couldn't be accepted at all. The yeshiva movement was very much for that. The Lubavitch yeshiva started, it was thought about in 1887. It only got set up in 1897, was when it finally got done, the same year as the first Zionist conference in Basel, but it was mainly in order to educate young Jewish men to be able to make them into rabbis, to then go and promote the concept of living as a halachic Jew, not identifying as a cultural Jew. And if a number of us, I know I can look at my family, the ancestors who were living in Vienna, who were living in Austrian Germany prior to 1839, they were very much cultural Jews. They, you know, from them, the perspective of religion, not much at all. But we will move on from there. I think we will have one more history one, because we're now getting up to a stage whereby for you, it's not really going to be history much anymore. Once we hit the 20th century, the first half of it, you know, we will then start to get into times which is not history for you. And it's far too recent. And we're going to have to think about what we will do next. I've got a few ideas, but I'll wait to hear from you. And if there are any questions, Ian, please be nice to me. Herzl back to Uganda because he foresaw the Holocaust and his desperation was for refuge to be available. I'm not sure whether Herzl foresaw the Holocaust and whether it's because of that. I can't deny it or not. Ian's nodding sagely. He foresaw the Holocaust. Very based. Maybe not the Holocaust. He saw what was happening. It wasn't the Holocaust per se. It was the pogroms in Russia that he was seeing, not the Holocaust per se.
No, it was not just that, but Weizmann saw it as well in 1910. He gave a speech about it. He saw the Holocaust coming from Germany in 1910.
I don't know. I'll take your word for it.
I had a copy of the speech once when we moved house from Crosby to Bowden. It got lost.
Oh, you have, like. All right. So as I say, we'll have one. Ralph, we can't hear you.
That's all right. I was just giving a. May I just interrupt? I apologise. Jonathan, I can't walk. Something's come up.
Okay. Right.
All right. So I say we'll have one more, and we'll do the events leading up to the Holocaust. We'll have a look from a religious perspective what's happening there. But then afterwards, I don't want to go beyond that because, as I say, for it's not really historical, and the people about who we're talking about, you may know firsthand, and it starts to get a little bit. Never discuss history with somebody who's actually lived through it because it then becomes personal. We want to just look at historical facts. What I think maybe we might do is we'll have a look at statesmen, philosophers, and doctors. Those three throughout history. So we at one point we did Rambam, but looking at him purely as a doctor. A statesman, we looked at Don Yosef Nassi, specifically as a statesman. So we'll go through historical backgrounds, but instead of doing centuries, we'll do people that led their lives as statesmen, philosophers, and doctors. Maybe
what
even
about
scientists.
lawyers? Are you leaving out lawyers?
Yes. Specifically leaving out lawyers. Yes. As I said, I like to deal with fact, not conjecture and bluff.
What about narrow gauge railways?
Constructive professions as opposed to destructive.